The bar might as well have been a photograph. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A rear admiral stood in the doorway between the private dining room and the main bar, tears glistening in eyes that had seen decades of command and combat and loss, speaking to a man in overalls who looked like he belonged on a tractor rather than in the presence of such rank. Earl stared at Caruso. For a long moment, recognition flickered just beneath the surface of his expression, struggling to connect the distinguished officer before him with the terrified young ensign he had pulled out of that valley half a century ago. There had been so many operations, so many extractions, so many young faces contorted with fear that he had guided through darkness and delivered to safety. But then something clicked. The eyes. Despite the years, despite the wrinkles and the silver hair and the stars on his collar, the eyes were the same. Earl had looked into those eyes while bullets screamed overhead and promised that he would get them out. All of them, no matter what it cost. Ensign Caruso, Earl said softly, and the name emerged like something excavated from deep underground, covered in the dust of years. You made it. Caruso crossed the room in 5 quick strides, moving with a purpose that parted the crowd before him. When he reached Earl's booth, he did not salute. He did not maintain the rigid formality that his rank demanded. Instead, he slid into the seat across from the old farmer and reached out to grip his hand with both of his own. "Because of you," Caruso said, his voice thick with emotion. "I made it because of you. We all did. 12 of us went home to our families because you held that position for 36 hours with bullets in you that you never mentioned until the helicopters landed." The bar had erupted into whispered conversations. Phones were appearing everywhere now, not just Andre Bishop's, as patrons recorded what they were witnessing. Senior Chief Cortez had moved closer, his expression oscillating between wonder and something that looked almost like worship. Greta stood frozen behind the bar, one hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. And Cameron Holt stood paralyzed in the middle of it all, watching his career and his certainty and everything he thought he understood about service crumble into dust around him. "You were just a kid," Earl said to Caruso, and his voice carried the gentleness of a man addressing a memory rather than a person. "Scared out of your mind. Kept asking me if we were going to make it. You told me to save my questions for the chaplain," Caruso replied, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "You said you were too busy keeping us alive to worry about whether God was paying attention." Earl almost smiled at that. Almost. The expression flickered across his weathered features like sunlight through storm clouds before disappearing back into the gray. "Prophet said that," Earl corrected quietly. "Everything good that came out of my mouth back then was something Prophet said first." The name seemed to hit Caruso like a physical blow. His grip on Earl's hand tightened, and his eyes dropped briefly before rising again to meet the old operator's gaze. "I know," he said. "I was there when he died. I saw what he did for you, what he did for all of us." The memory crashed over Earl like a wave, dragging him under before he could prepare. The jungle, the chaos. Prophet's voice cutting through the gunfire with that impossible calm he always maintained. "Something is wrong, Earl. Get down." The push. The impact of Prophet's body against his own, driving him into the mud a split second before the machine gun burst tore through the space where he had been standing. The wet heat of blood that was not his own soaking through his fatigues. The desperate scramble to turn Prophet over, to apply pressure, to do something, anything, while his best friend looked up at him with eyes that were already beginning to fade. Prophet had smiled. Even then, even with his life pouring out onto the jungle floor, Darnell Washington had smiled that crooked smile and made one last joke. "Told you something bad was coming," Prophet had said, his voice barely a whisper. "Didn't say it was for me." Earl had held him for 90 seconds while the femoral artery that the shrapnel had severed pumped his best friend's life into the mud. 90 seconds that lasted an eternity. 90 seconds that had replayed in his mind every single day for 53 years. "I held him," Earl said, and his voice cracked for the first time, the facade of calm dignity fracturing under the weight of grief that had never fully healed. "I held him and I watched him die, and I could not do anything to stop it." The best man I ever knew bled out in my arms because he pushed me out of the way, because he saved my life instead of his own. Caruso squeezed his hand. I know, he repeated. I know. And I have spent my entire career trying to live up to what you both did that night, trying to be worthy of the life you gave me. The Admiral looked up, his gaze sweeping across the silent bar, taking the young SEALs and the old veterans and the civilians who had stumbled into a moment they would never forget. His eyes landed on Holt, and something hardened in his expression. You, he said, and the single word carried the weight of command that had directed ships and operations and the lives of thousands. Lieutenant, come here. Holt approached on legs that felt wooden and unreliable. His face had gone pale, the arrogance of 20 minutes ago replaced by something that looked very much like fear. He stopped 3 feet from the booth and stood at attention, though no one had ordered him to. Do you know who this man is? Caruso asked, his voice cold and measured. Do you have any idea what he has done for this country? For the teams? For every single one of us who wears the trident? Holt swallowed hard. Sir, I did not know. I thought he was... You thought he was what? A fraud? A pretender? Some old man playing dress-up? Caruso's voice rose slightly, carrying across the silent bar. This man is Master Chief Earl Jessup, call sign Scarecrow. He has 4 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts. He is credited with saving 47 American lives in direct combat action across 13 deployments. He trained 3 generations of operators. He wrote tactical doctrine that we still use today. And you stood there and accused him of stolen valor because he does not look the way you think a hero should look. Sir Holt started, but Caruso cut him off. I'm not finished, Lieutenant. The Admiral's eyes blazed. This man held a position for 36 hours with 2 bullets in him to save my life and the lives of 11 other Americans. He watched his best friend die in his arms and then kept fighting because that is what operators do. He gave everything he had to this country, and when he finally asked for one thing in return, the chance to disappear and live out his days in peace, we gave it to him. And now you have taken that from him because you could not keep your mouth shut and your assumptions to yourself. The bar was utterly silent. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation unfolding in that corner booth. Andre Bishop had lowered his phone, no longer recording, his face stricken with the realization of what he had almost helped create. Earl looked at Holt, at the young man's pale face and trembling hands and eyes that glistened with the beginnings of tears. And despite everything, despite the anger and the grief and the exhaustion of having his carefully constructed anonymity torn away, he felt something unexpected. He felt pity. That is enough, Admiral, Earl said quietly. Caruso turned to look at him in surprise. The boy made a mistake. He does not need to be destroyed for it. Caruso stared at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. You always did have more mercy than the rest of us, he said softly. Even back then, even in the middle of hell. The mercy in Earl's voice seemed to break something open in the room. The tension that had been building like a thunderhead began to shift, transforming from confrontation into something else entirely. Something that felt almost sacred. Senior Chief Cortez stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching an altar. When he reached the booth where Earl and Caruso sat, he came to attention with a precision that spoke of decades of discipline. His hand rose to his brow in a salute that trembled slightly with emotion. Master Chief Jessup, he said, his voice rough. Senior Chief Raymond Cortez. I have been teaching your methods to BUD/S candidates for 12 years. I have a photograph of you on my office wall. Every class that comes through, I point to that picture and tell them that is the standard. That is what we are trying to create. He paused, his throat working. It is the honor of my life to meet you, sir. Earl looked up at the saluting man and felt something shift in his chest. For so long, he had run from this, from the recognition, from the reverence, from the weight of being a symbol rather than a man. He had buried himself in Nebraska soil and silence, convinced that Scarecrow needed to stay dead so that Earl Jessup could survive. But looking at Cortez now, at the tears streaming unashamedly down the senior chief's face, at the profound respect that radiated from every line of his body. Earl understood something he had never allowed himself to accept. The legend was not a burden he had to carry alone. It was a gift he had given to everyone who came after him, a standard to aspire to, a proof of what was possible when human beings pushed beyond every limit. At ease, Chief, Earl said softly, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to surprise even him. The voice of a master chief who had led men through hell and brought them out the other side. You honor Prophet's memory by teaching the next generation. That is more than I ever did. Cortez lowered his salute, but did not relax. His eyes remained fixed on Earl with an intensity that bordered on worship. Around the bar, others were beginning to move. Veterans who had been sitting quietly, nursing drinks and memories, rose from their seats and approached the corner booth. Some wore insignia that marked them as former SEALs. Others bore the marks of different branches, different wars, different generations of service. But all of them recognized what they were witnessing. All of them understood the magnitude of the moment. One by one, they formed a loose semicircle around the booth. One by one, they came to attention. One by one, they saluted. Earl looked at them, at these men who had served and sacrificed and carried their own scars and their own ghosts. His throat tightened. His eyes burned with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in decades. Greta had emerged from behind the bar, wiping her face with her apron. She moved through the crowd until she reached the photograph on the wall, the faded image that had hung there since her father's time. With careful hands, she lifted it from its hook and brought it to the booth, setting it on the table between Earl and Caruso. My father served in Vietnam, she said quietly. He never talked about it much, but he kept this picture, said these men were the reason he made it home to marry my mother, to have me. She pointed to a figure in the background of the image, a young man with a round face and terrified eyes. That is him, Private First Class Thomas Mullins. He was one of the 12. Earl stared at the photograph, at the faces of men he had not thought about in half a century. At Prophet, grinning in the center of the frame like he knew a joke no one else would understand. At himself, young and thin and marked with the fresh scar that would never fully fade. Your father, Earl said slowly, processing the revelation. Tommy Mullins. He was so scared that first night. Kept asking Prophet if we were going to die. Prophet told him that death was optional, and he was choosing to skip it. Greta laughed through her tears. That sounds like I have carried this since 1971, he said. It was Prophet's. He gave it to me the night before the operation. Told me it would keep me safe. He smiled sadly. I have held on to it for 53 years because I could never find you to give it back. Earl picked up the coin with trembling fingers. The insignia was barely visible now, eroded by decades of touch, but he recognized it immediately. He had been there when Prophet received it, had watched his friend laugh and say that he finally had proof he was not completely useless. You should have kept it, Earl whispered. Maybe it would have protected him instead of you. Caruso shook his head. He knew what he was doing when he gave it to me. Prophet always knew. That was his gift. He saw things before they happened. He looked at Earl with eyes that held half a century of gratitude and grief. He saw that I was going to need it more than he would. The coin sat in Earl's palm like a fragment of the past, made tangible. He closed his fingers around it, feeling the worn edges press into his skin, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Cameron Holt had not moved from where Caruso's words had frozen him. He stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the veterans salute, watching the civilians weep, watching a legend emerge from the disguise of an ordinary man. His earlier arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by a shame so profound it seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Webb appeared at his side, speaking in a low voice that only Holt could hear. You need to make this right, Cam. Not for your career, not for your reputation, for yourself. Because if you walk out of here without apologizing, you will carry this for the rest of your life. Holt nodded slowly. His eyes were fixed on Earl, on the weathered hands holding Prophet's coin, on the tears that the old operator was no longer trying to hide. He had spent his entire career believing that he understood what it meant to be a SEAL, believing that the trident on his chest made him part of something elite and eternal, believing that the legends he had heard were exaggerations, stories inflated by time and repetition. Now he understood that the legends were not exaggerated at all. If anything, they had been understated. The man sitting in that booth had done things that defied explanation, had sacrificed in ways that Holt could barely comprehend, had carried wounds both visible and invisible for longer than Holt had been alive. And Holt had accused him of being a fraud. The shame burned like acid in his chest. But beneath the shame, something else was stirring, something that felt almost like gratitude, because he had been given a gift tonight, even if it had come wrapped in humiliation. He had been given the chance to see what real service looked like, what real sacrifice meant, what real heroes were made of, and he would spend the rest of his career trying to be worthy of that lesson. The salutes held for a long moment, suspended in time like a photograph that would never fade. Earl looked at each face in turn, reading the stories written there in scars and wrinkles and eyes that had seen too much. These men understood him in ways that civilians never could. They carried their own ghosts, their own midnight visitors, their own names that echoed in the silence of sleepless nights. Finally, Earl nodded. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement, of brotherhood, of shared sacrifice across generations. As you were, he said quietly. The veterans lowered their salutes, but did not disperse. They remained gathered around the booth, drawn together by something stronger than curiosity. The civilians in the bar had pressed back against the walls, giving space to a ritual they did not fully understand but instinctively respected. Admiral Caruso had not taken his eyes off Earl. The emotions playing across his face were complex, layered, the accumulated weight of 53 years finally finding release. "I need to know," Caruso said. "After everything, after Prophet, after all those years of service, why did you disappear? Why did you ask us to declare you dead?" Earl was silent for a long moment. His thumb traced the worn surface of Prophet's coin, back and forth, a meditative gesture that seemed to help him gather thoughts that had been scattered for decades. "Because I was dying anyway," he finally said. "Not fast, not from bullets or shrapnel, but dying all the same. Every night, I was back in that jungle. Every morning, I woke up reaching for Prophet, forgetting for just a second that he was gone. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the way I would hear a car backfire and find myself on the ground with my hands over my head before I knew what was happening." He paused, his jaw tightening with the effort of putting words to things he had never spoken aloud. "Margaret saved me," he continued. "My wife. She found me at a VA hospital in 1975, sitting in a corner talking to people who were not there. She was a nurse. Could have walked away. Should have walked away. But she sat down next to me and asked if the people I was talking to were friends of mine." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "I told her they were the best friends I ever had. She asked if she could meet them. So I introduced her to Prophet, told her about his jokes, his gift for seeing danger, the way he smiled even when everything was falling apart. She listened for 3 hours. Never looked at me like I was crazy. Never tried to tell me they were not real." Greta wiped fresh tears from her cheeks. Around the bar, people leaned in, drawn into the story despite themselves. "She married me 6 months later," Earl said. "Brought me back to Nebraska, to the farm where I grew up. Gave me 30 years of peace. 2 children. A reason to keep breathing." He looked down at the coin in his hand. "When she died, the peace died with her. And I realized that without her, I did not know how to be Earl Jessup anymore. All I knew how to be was Scarecrow. And Scarecrow was a killer. A ghost. A weapon. Not a father. Not a grandfather. Not anything that belonged in the world she had built for us." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "So I asked them to let me die," he said. "Let Scarecrow die at least. Let the legend end, so that maybe, somehow, the man could figure out how to keep living without her." Caruso reached across the table and gripped Earl's forearm, the same arm that Holt had grabbed what felt like hours ago, but had been barely 30 minutes. "And did you," Caruso asked softly, "figure out how to keep living?" Earl's laugh was hollow, empty of humor. I learned how to exist, he said. How to wake up and work the land and feed the animals and fall asleep exhausted enough that sometimes the nightmares did not come. I learned how to be invisible, how to be nobody, how to walk through the world without leaving a mark. He looked around the bar, at the faces watching him, at the phones that had been recording, at the evidence of his anonymity crumbling around him. I was good at it, he said. For 22 years, I was good at it. Drove 40 miles once a month to sit in this bar and watch young sailors and remember what it felt like to belong to something. Never talked to anyone. Never let anyone see me. He looked at Holt, who still stood frozen at the edge of the gathering. Until tonight, Holt flinched at the attention, at the reminder of his role in unraveling everything Earl had built. But he did not look away. He held the old man's gaze with an effort that was visible in the tension of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. Webb nudged him forward. Holt took one step, then another, until he stood directly before the booth. The veterans parted to let him through, their expressions ranging from contempt to pity to something harder to define. Master Chief Jessup, Holt said, and his voice cracked on the name. He cleared his throat and tried again. Master Chief Jessup, I have no words that can undo what I did tonight. No apology that is adequate to the disrespect I showed you. He paused, struggling with the weight of what he needed to say. I looked at you and saw an old man in dirty clothes, he continued. I saw someone I thought was pretending to be something he was not. And I was so certain, so arrogant in my certainty, that I never stopped to consider that I might be wrong. That the trident on my chest does not give me the right to judge anyone. That the greatest operators in our history do not look like movie stars or action heroes. They look like you, quiet, humble, carrying wounds that no one else can see. Holt's voice broke. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and he did not try to hide them. I am sorry, he said. Not because Admiral Caruso is here. Not because my career might be over. I am sorry because I failed the most basic test of what it means to wear this trident. I failed to recognize a brother. I failed to show respect to a man who earned more respect in one night than I may earn in my entire career. He came to attention and saluted, his form perfect despite the trembling of his hand. I have no right to ask your forgiveness, he said, but I'm asking anyway. Not for myself, for the chance to spend the rest of my service trying to become worthy of the legacy you built. Earl studied the young man for a long moment. He saw the shame, the sincerity, the desperate hope for redemption that burned behind the tears. He saw himself, 50 years ago, making mistakes and learning from them and slowly becoming the operator that legends would be built around. And he made a decision. Lower your hand, son, Earl said quietly. Sit down. Let me tell you about the man whose coin you are looking at. Let me tell you about Prophet. Because if you really want to honor my legacy, you need to understand that I was never the best of us. He was. And everything I ever did right, I learned from him. Holt lowered his salute and sank into the seat across from Earl, next to Admiral Caruso. His teammates gathered behind him, Webb and Brennan and Bishop, their earlier bravado replaced by the hushed reverence of students entering a classroom they had not known existed. The bar had transformed. What had been a Friday night crowd of sailors and civilians was now an audience gathered around a storyteller, drawn by something primal and ancient, the need to hear truth spoken by someone who had lived it. Earl turned Prophet's coin over in his fingers, watching the dim light catch its worn surface. Darnell Washington grew up in Detroit. He began, his voice taking on a cadence that suggested he had told this story before, if only to himself in the darkness of sleepless nights. His father worked 3 jobs and still could not keep the lights on. His mother died when he was 12. He raised his 2 younger sisters on food stamps and stubbornness and a refusal to let circumstances define him. He looked up, meeting Holt's eyes. He joined the Navy at 17 because a recruiter promised him 3 meals a day and a chance to be something. Same reason I joined, growing up poor on a dying farm in Nebraska. We met at BUD/S in 1968. I was the skinny white kid who looked like a scarecrow. He was the black kid from the city who everyone expected to quit first. A sad smile crossed Earl's weathered face. We proved them all wrong. Both of us. Made it through Hell Week side by side, taking turns carrying each other when our legs gave out. By the time we earned our tridents, we were closer than brothers. We knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken, knew each other's fears before they were admitted, knew each other's strengths and weaknesses better than we knew our own. Senior Chief Cortez had moved closer, drinking in every word. This was history that no textbook contained, no training manual preserved. This was the living memory of legends. They called him Prophet because he could sense things. Earl continued. Ambushes, traps, danger that had no visible source. He would get this look in his eyes, this stillness, and he would say something is wrong, and we would all hit the dirt a half second before bullets started flying. Saved my life more times than I could count. Saved everyone's life. He paused, until the one time he could not save his own. The bar was utterly silent. Even the ice in glasses had stopped shifting. November 14th, 1971, Earl said, and his voice dropped lower, rougher, dragged down by the weight of memory. We inserted at 0200 for what was supposed to be a routine extraction. CIA asset embedded with a Viet Cong cell needed to come home. Simple in, simple out. Except nothing was simple that night. His eyes grew distant, seeing things that existed only in the past. They were waiting for us. Hundreds of them. Someone had talked, or someone had guessed, or maybe the jungle itself had betrayed us. We were outnumbered 10-1 before we even knew we were in a fight. Lost 3 men in the first 30 seconds. The rest of us fell back to a valley that became a killing ground. Admiral Caruso's hand tightened on the edge of the table. He was back there too, reliving the terror of that night through the lens of Earl's words. 12 of us made it to that valley, Earl said. 12 Americans trapped behind enemy lines with no extraction coming until dawn. 9 hours away. Might as well have been 9 years. He looked at Caruso. You remember what Prophet said when we realized how bad it was? Caruso nodded slowly. He said, death is optional tonight. I am choosing to skip it. Earl almost smiled. That was Prophet, staring down impossible odds and cracking jokes like we were at a barbecue instead of a battlefield. He kept everyone's spirits up while I figured out how to keep everyone's bodies intact. He fell silent for a moment, gathering himself for what came next. We held that position for 36 hours. I do not remember most of it, just fragments. Muzzle flashes in the darkness. The smell of cordite and blood. Prophet beside me, always beside me, calling out targets and covering my blind spots and making jokes that kept the young ones from falling apart. His voice grew thick. The extraction choppers were 20 minutes out when it happened. We had made it. Against every odd, against every reasonable expectation, we had held long enough. I let myself believe we were going to survive. Earl closed his eyes. Prophet saw it first. He always saw it first. A machine gun, nest we had missed, dug in on a ridge we thought was clear. The gunner was drawing a bead on me. I did not know. I was focused on the tree line, waiting for the next wave. I did not see death pointing at me from 50 meters away. A tear escaped from beneath his closed eyelid and traced a path down his weathered cheek. But Prophet saw it, and he did not hesitate, did not warn me, did not give me time to react. He just moved, threw himself into me, knocked me into the mud a half second before the burst came through. Earl opened his eyes. They were red-rimmed and glistening. The rounds that were meant for me went through him instead. Shrapnel from the impact severed his femoral artery. There was nothing anyone could do. Nothing I could do except hold him and watch him die. Hold it stop breathing. Tears streamed freely down his face now, and he did not care who saw them. His last words were a joke. Earl said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me with blood pouring out of him, and he smiled that crooked smile, and he said, told you something bad was coming. Didn't say it was for me. The words hung in the air like a prayer, like a eulogy, like the final breath of a man who had been dead for 53 years, but who had never truly left. 90 seconds, Earl said. That is how long it took. 90 seconds from the moment he pushed me down to the moment he was gone. I held him the whole time. Told him he was going to be fine. Told him the choppers were almost there. Told him every lie I could think of because I could not tell him the truth. He looked down at the coin in his hand. The truth was that the best man I ever knew was dying in my arms because he loved me more than he loved himself. Because that is what brothers do. That is what real operators do. They do not hesitate. They do not calculate. They just move. And sometimes the cost of that movement is everything. Earl raised his eyes to meet Holt's. That is the legacy you are inheriting, son. Not medals. Not legends. Not stories told in bars by old men who should have died 50 years ago. The legacy is sacrifice. The legacy is love. The legacy is being willing to give everything for the man beside you without a moment's thought. He pressed the coin in Holt's palm and closed the young man's fingers around it. Prophet gave this to Admiral Caruso to keep him safe. Caruso kept it for 53 years. Now I'm giving it to you. Not because you deserve it, but because someday if you work hard enough and sacrifice enough and love the man beside you enough, you might. Holt stared at the coin in his palm. The weight of it seemed impossible, far heavier than the small disc of metal should have been. He understood now that he was not holding a challenge coin. He was holding 53 years of grief and gratitude and brotherhood compressed into something he could carry in his pocket. I do not deserve this, he said, his voice raw. No, Earl agreed. You do not. But Prophet did not deserve to die at 24 years old either. Deserve has nothing to do with any of it. What matters is what you do with what you are given. The bar remained frozen in that suspended moment, witnesses to something that transcended the ordinary rhythms of a Friday night. Andre Bishop had pocketed his phone long ago, ashamed now of his impulse to record what he had thought would be entertainment. Webb stood with his hand on Holt's shoulder, steadying his team leader through the weight of revelation. Admiral Caruso cleared his throat. The sound broke something loose in the room, a collective exhale that seemed to release tension that had been building since the first accusatory words were spoken. Master Chief, Caruso said formally, I need to ask you something. And I need you to understand that this is not a request from an admiral to a retired enlisted man. This is a request from one of the 12 men whose lives you saved to the man who saved them. Earl met his gaze. The wariness that had defined him for decades flickered in his eyes, the instinct to retreat back into anonymity warring with something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Ask, Earl said. Come back, Caruso said simply. Not to active duty, not to operations, but to us, to the community. We have young men like Lieutenant Holt who have all the training and all the skills, but none of the wisdom. They do not understand what service really means because the men who could teach them are gone, dead or retired or hidden away on farms in Nebraska pretending to be nobody. Earl shook his head slowly. I'm not a teacher. I'm just an old man with too many memories and not enough reasons to keep carrying them. Cortez stepped forward, his voice urgent. With respect, Master Chief, that is exactly what makes you qualified. The young operators coming through my program, they think they understand sacrifice because they made it through Hell Week. They think they understand brotherhood because they wear the same uniform. But they do not know. They cannot know. Not until someone who has lived it shows them what it really costs. Earl looked at the senior chief, at the desperation in his eyes, at the plea that went beyond words. I have a photograph of you on my wall, Cortez continued. I point to it every class and tell them that is the standard. But a photograph is not enough. Stories are not enough. They need to see that legends are not myths. They need to know that the men who built our legacy were real people who bled and grieved and kept going anyway. The veterans gathered around the booth murmured agreement. These were men who understood isolation, who knew what it meant to carry burdens that civilians could never comprehend. They saw in Earl a reflection of their own struggles, their own attempts to find meaning after the uniform came off. A woman's voice cut through the murmur. Commander Patricia Yates had risen from her table near the back, where she had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. She was 61 years old, her silver hair cropped short, her bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes she wore. Master Chief Jessup, she said, approaching the booth with measured steps. I run a veteran transition program here in San Diego. Non-profit, no government funding. Just veterans helping veterans find their way back to the world. Earl studied her with guarded eyes. I know what transition programs look like, he said. Paperwork and therapy sessions and well-meaning people who have never heard a shot fired in anger trying to explain how to process trauma. Yates smiled, and there was steel beneath the warmth. My program is nothing like that. No paperwork. No bureaucracy. Just a room full of people who have seen the same darkness you have, talking when they want to talk and staying silent when they need silence. She paused. I have been trying to find someone with your experience to help lead our group for 5 years. Someone who understands what these men and women are carrying. Someone who has walked through hell and found a way to keep walking. Earl was quiet for a long moment. His thumb traced the edge of the table, a repetitive motion that seemed to help him think. I spent 22 years hiding, he finally said. 22 years convincing myself that disappearing was the right thing to do. That being nobody was better than being a symbol. That running from the legend was the only way to survive being the man behind it. He looked around the bar, at the faces watching him, at the young SEALs and the old veterans and the civilians who had stumbled into a moment that would reshape their understanding of service and sacrifice. Maybe I was wrong, he said quietly. Maybe running was never survival. Maybe it was just another kind of dying, slower and lonelier than the quick death I was afraid of. Caruso leaned forward. What are you saying, Earl? Earl drew a deep breath. It was the breath of a man standing at a crossroads, knowing that the choice he made in the next few seconds would determine the shape of whatever years he had left. I am saying that Prophet did not push me into that mud, so I could spend the rest of my life pretending to be nobody. He gave me 53 years that he did not get. 53 years I have wasted being invisible. He looked at Holt, at the coin still clutched in the young man's hand. I am saying that maybe it is time to stop running. Maybe it is time to be Scarecrow again. Not the killer, not the ghost, but the teacher, the example, the proof that survival is not betrayal, that carrying on does not mean forgetting the ones we lost. Commander Yates extended her hand. We meet every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she said. No pressure, no expectations. You show up when you can. You share what you want. The door is always open, and it is always your choice whether to walk through it. Earl looked at her hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. Tuesday, he said. I will be there. The bar erupted. Not in applause, but in something deeper. Veterans stepped forward to shake his hand, to introduce themselves, to share fragments of their own stories. Civilians wiped tears from their faces. Greta poured drinks on the house, her father's photograph now propped up on the bar where everyone could see it. And in the middle of it all, Earl Jessup sat in his corner booth and felt something he had not felt in 22 years. He felt like he belonged. The hours passed like minutes. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into something resembling a reunion, a gathering of souls connected by service and sacrifice, even if they had never met before this night. The Anchor's Rest had become sacred ground, a place where the walls between generations dissolved and the brotherhood that bound all warriors together revealed itself in its truest form. Earl found himself surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to sit in his presence and listen. Young SEALs asked questions about operations that had been classified before they were born. Old veterans shared their own stories, finding in Earl's willingness to speak a permission they had never granted themselves. Civilians listened with the reverent attention of people witnessing something they knew they would tell their children about someday. Through it all, Earl talked, not about tactics or medals or the dry details of military history. He talked about Prophet, about the jokes that never stopped, about the gift for sensing danger, about the way his friend could make anyone feel like the most important person in the world simply by paying attention to them. He was better than me at everything that mattered, Earl said to a cluster of young operators who had gathered at his booth. Better at reading people, better at keeping morale up, better at remembering why we were fighting in the first place. I was just the one who was better at killing. That is not something to be proud of. Webb leaned forward, his earlier skepticism completely erased. Then why did they build the legend around you instead of him? Earl's smile was sad. Because I survived. That is the only difference between a legend and a forgotten name on a wall. Survival. He shook his head. Prophet should have been the one they told stories about. He should have been the standard on Senior Chief Cortez's wall. But the bullet took him, and it left me, and so here I am, telling stories about a man who deserved to tell his own. Admiral Caruso had remained at the booth for most of the evening, occasionally excusing himself to make calls or speak with his aide. Now he returned with a look on his face that mixed satisfaction with something more solemn. "I have been making some arrangements," he said quietly, sliding back into his seat. "With your permission, Master Chief, I would like to make some things official." Earl regarded him with wary eyes. "What kind of arrangements?" Caruso pulled out his phone and showed Earl a photograph. It was a medal, gold and blue, and instantly recognizable to anyone who had served. The Navy Cross. "Your service record lists 4 of these," Caruso said, "but there should be 5. The operation where Prophet died, where you held that position for 36 hours, it was classified at the time. The recommendation for your 5th Navy Cross was filed, but never processed because officially the operation never happened." Earl stared at the photograph. "I do not need another medal," he said. "I have enough medal in boxes I never open." "It is not about what you need," Caruso replied gently. "It is about what you earned. What Prophet earned." The recommendation also included a posthumous Navy Cross for Petty Officer Washington. That was never processed either. The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Prophet's name, caught in bureaucratic limbo for 53 years, denied the recognition he deserved because the mission he died on was too sensitive to acknowledge. "You can make that happen?" Earl asked, his voice rough. "I can make that happen," Caruso confirmed. "I have been making calls all evening. The classification has been lifted. The paperwork is being expedited. There will be a ceremony at the base next month. Full honors. Your 5th Navy Cross. Prophet's posthumous award." He paused. "I would like you to accept his medal on behalf of his family." Earl closed his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried, heavier than the memories that had haunted him for half a century. "Prophet had 2 sisters," he said quietly. "He raised them after their mother died. I lost touch with them after the funeral. After I fell apart. We found them," Caruso said. "Both of them. Elaine lives in Chicago. Michelle is in Atlanta. They have been trying to find information about their brother's service for decades, but everything was classified. They did not even know how he really died." Earl opened his eyes. Tears spilled freely down his weathered cheeks now, and he made no attempt to hide them. "They deserve to know," he said. "They deserve to know what kind of man their brother was. What he did. How he died, saving someone who has spent 53 years wishing it had been him instead." Caruso nodded. "They will be at the ceremony. I spoke with Elaine an hour ago. When I told her we had found the man her brother died saving, she broke down. She said she has been waiting her whole life to thank you." Earl shook his head. "Thank me. I got her brother killed." "No," Caruso said firmly. "Prophet got himself killed saving you. There's a difference. A choice was made, and it was not yours. It was his. And from everything you have told us about him, it was exactly the choice he would make again if he had to." The Admiral leaned forward, his voice dropping to something private despite the crowd around them. "Elaine told me something else," he said. "She told me that the last letter Prophet sent home, the one that arrived 2 weeks after the notification of his death, talked about you. About his swim buddy. About the skinny kid from Nebraska who looked like a scarecrow but fought like a demon. About how, if anything ever happened, she should not blame you because war does not care about blame." Earl's breath caught in his throat. "Prophet wrote about me. He wrote about his brother," Caruso said simply. "That is what you were to him, what you still are. And his family has spent 53 years wanting to meet the man Darnell loved enough to die for." The bar had grown quiet again as words spread of the conversation happening at the corner booth. People strained to hear, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Earl sat motionless for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. The medal he had never received. The recognition Prophet had been denied. The sisters who had grown old waiting for answers that bureaucracy had kept locked away. And underneath it all, a letter. Words from beyond the grave. Prophet's voice reaching across 53 years to deliver a message that Earl had needed to hear since the moment his friend died in his arms. Not your fault. Never your fault. Tell them I will be there, Earl finally said, his voice steady despite the tears. Tell them I will accept Prophet's medal. Tell them I will tell them every story I have. Tell them their brother was the best man I ever knew, and I have spent 53 years trying to be worthy of the gift he gave me. He looked around the bar, at the faces watching him, at the community that had formed around his revelation. And tell them, he added quietly, that I am finally ready to stop running from it. The night wound down slowly, reluctantly, as if the bar itself did not want to release the moment it had witnessed. Last call came and went, but Greta made no move to close. Some things were more important than liquor laws and business hours. Earl remained in his booth long after most of the crowd had dispersed. Admiral Caruso had left with promises to call in the morning with details about the ceremony. Senior Chief Cortez had extracted a commitment from Earl to visit the training facility, to speak to the candidates, to show them that the standard on the wall was flesh and blood. Commander Yates had pressed a card into his hand with the address of her program and a simple message written on the back. The door is always open. Now only a handful of people remained. Greta, wiping down the bar with the same rag she had used 1,000 times before. Webb and Brennan, sitting quietly at a nearby table, processing everything they had witnessed. And Holt, still in the booth across from Earl, Prophet's coin clutched in his hand like a talisman. The young lieutenant had barely spoken in hours. He had listened to every story, absorbed every detail, watched as the legend he had dismissed revealed himself to be something far more complex and human than any myth could capture. The shame of his earlier behavior had not faded, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt almost like purpose. Master Chief, Holt said quietly, breaking a silence that had stretched for several minutes. I need to tell you something. Earl looked at him with those ancient eyes, patient and waiting. Before tonight, Holt continued, I thought I understood what it meant to be a SEAL. I thought the Trident was proof that I had made it, that I had reached the top, that I was part of something elite and exclusive and better than everyone else. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. The Trident is not proof of anything except that I survived training. It is not a destination. It is a starting point. And I have been standing at that starting point for years, convinced I had already arrived. Earl nodded slowly. Most young operators feel that way. It is not a character flaw. It is just inexperience dressed up as confidence. Holt met his gaze. How do I fix it? How do I become what you are instead of what I was tonight? Earl considered the question for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the photograph that Greta had left on the bar, the faded image of young men who had no idea what was waiting for them in the jungle. You do not become what I am, he finally said. You become what Prophet was. He leaned forward slightly. I am a killer, son. That is what they made me. That is what I was good at. But Prophet was something more. He was a leader, a brother, a man who made everyone around him better just by being present. That is what the teams need. Not more killers, more prophets. Holt looked down at the coin in his hand. How do I do that? You start by listening more than you talk. You pay attention to the men around you. Learn their fears and their strengths and what keeps them fighting when everything falls apart. You put their needs before your pride. You admit when you are wrong, loudly and publicly, so they know it is safe to make mistakes. Earl paused, and you remember that every person you meet, whether they're wearing a trident or overalls or a suit and tie, has a story you do not know, a burden you cannot see, a battle they are fighting that has nothing to do with you. The words settled over Holt like a weight and a gift simultaneously. He understood that he was being given something precious, wisdom earned through decades of suffering that most people would never experience. I want to learn, Holt said, not just tactics and techniques. I want to learn how to be the kind of operator Prophet was, the kind who makes the men around him better. Earl studied him for a long moment, reading something in the young man's face that seemed to satisfy him. Then come to Commander Yates's program with me, he said. Tuesday evening. Listen to the men and women there. Hear their stories. Understand what service costs over a lifetime not just during deployment. He paused. And bring your team. Webb and Brennan and Bishop. They need to hear it too. Holt nodded, a new determination settling into his features. We will be there. Greta approached the booth, her father's photograph cradled in her hands. She had been crying again, quietly, the kind of tears that came from deep wells of emotion that had been sealed for decades. I called my mother, she said. Told her what happened tonight. Told her about you. About Prophet. About how my father made it home because of what you both did. Earl looked up at her, waiting. She wants to meet you, Greta continued. She is 87 years old. She has been a widow for 15 years. But she remembers my father talking about that night. Talking about the skinny operator who came out of nowhere and saved them all. She said she has been praying for you every Sunday since 1971. The words hit Earl somewhere deep, in a place he had thought was beyond reaching. 53 years of prayers from a woman he had never met, offered on behalf of a man she had never thanked. I would be honored to meet her, Earl said quietly. Greta nodded, wiping her eyes. And I want you to have this. She held out the photograph. My father would have wanted you to have it. He talked about that night until the day he died. Said it was the night he learned what brotherhood really meant. Earl took the photograph with trembling hands. The faces looked back at him across the decades, young and scared and alive. Prophet grinned from the center of the frame, frozen forever in that moment before everything changed. I will take care of it, Earl promised. I will make sure their story is told. He looked around the bar one last time, at Greta, who had become a link to a past he thought was lost, at Holt and his teammates, who represented a future he had never expected to be part of, at the empty spaces where the crowd had stood, witnesses to a night that would ripple outward in ways none of them could predict. The Anchor's Rest had been his refuge for 6 years, a place to hide, a place to watch from the shadows and pretend he was still connected to something larger than himself. Now it had become something else, a place where Scarecrow had come back from the dead, a place where Prophet's legacy had finally found its voice, a place where an old farmer in overalls had remembered what it meant to be a warrior. Earl rose slowly from the booth, his joints protesting the hours of sitting. He tucked the photograph carefully inside his flannel shirt, next to the dog tags that had rested against his heart for 53 years. Same time next month, Greta asked, a smile breaking through her tears. Earl shook his head. Sooner than that. I have been hiding for too long. He looked at Holt. Tuesday evening. Commander Yates's program. Do not be late. He walked toward the door, his gait steadier than it had been in years. The weight on his shoulders had not disappeared, but it had shifted somehow, distributed across the new connections he had made, shared with the people who had witnessed his emergence from anonymity. At the door, he paused and looked back. Prophet always said death was optional, he said quietly. I think I finally understand what he meant. It is not about whether you stop breathing. It is about whether you stop living. And with that, Earl Jessup walked out into the California night, leaving behind the ghost he had been and stepping into the man he was finally ready to become. 3 months later, the ceremony took place on a perfect California morning. The sun hung bright over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, its light catching the white dress uniforms assembled in precise rows on the parade ground. Flags snapped in the ocean breeze. A military band played softly as dignitaries and families found their seats. Earl stood at the edge of the formation, wearing his dress blues for the first time in over 2 decades. The uniform still fit, though it hung differently on his frame than it had when he was young and lean and convinced he was immortal. Margaret had kept it pressed and preserved in their closet through all the years of their marriage, as if she knew someday he would need it again. Beside him stood 2 women in their 70s. Elaine Washington had her brother's eyes, dark and warm, and carrying a depth that seemed to see past surfaces into the truth beneath. Michelle Washington had his smile, that crooked grin that Earl had seen 1,000 times in the jungle, in the barracks, in the moments before everything went wrong. They had arrived in San Diego 3 days earlier. Earl had met them at the airport, holding a photograph of Prophet that he had carried in his wallet since 1971. The reunion had been wordless at first, three strangers bound by a man who had been dead for longer than he had been alive. Then Elaine had wrapped her arms around Earl and whispered, "Thank you for loving my brother," and all the words that needed to be spoken found their way out in the hours that followed. He told them everything: the jokes, the gift, the night in the valley, the 90 seconds that had lasted 53 years. He told them about the guilt he had carried and the years he had wasted hiding from a sacrifice he could never repay. And they had listened and wept and forgiven him for sins he had never actually committed. "Darnell did not save you so you could spend your life apologizing," Elaine had said. "He saved you so you could live. That is all he would have wanted. That is all any of us want." Now they stood together as Admiral Caruso approached the podium, his voice carrying across the parade ground with the authority of rank and the weight of personal history. "We are gathered here today to correct an injustice that has persisted for 53 years, Caruso began. "To honor two men whose actions on the night of November 14th, 1971, exemplified the highest traditions of naval special warfare. To finally give recognition that was earned in blood and sacrifice and brotherhood." Earl listened as Caruso recounted the operation, the ambush, the impossible odds, the 36 hours of hell that had forged legends out of ordinary men. He heard his own name spoken with reverence, his own actions described in terms that made them sound almost mythical. But it was Prophet's name that made him stand straighter. Prophet's story that brought tears to his eyes. Prophet's sacrifice that the Admiral described with a precision and respect that the moment deserved. Petty Officer First Class Darnell Washington gave his life so that his brothers could live, Caruso said. He saw death coming for a man he loved, and he chose without hesitation to take that death upon himself. There is no greater love than this. There is no greater courage. And there is no greater honor than finally, after 53 years, recognizing what he did. Elaine stepped forward when her brother's name was called. Earl walked beside her, supporting her arm as she approached the Admiral. The posthumous Navy Cross gleamed in its presentation case, gold and blue against white silk. "On behalf of a grateful nation," Caruso said, his voice thick with emotion, "and in recognition of extraordinary heroism in combat, I present the Navy Cross to the family of Petty Officer First Class Darnell Prophet Washington." Elaine accepted the medal with hands that trembled. She held it to her chest for a moment, eyes closed, communing with a brother she had lost when she was barely 20 years old. Then she turned to Earl and pressed the case into his hands. "He would want you to have this," she said quietly. "He would want his brother to carry it." Earl shook his head. "This belongs to your family." "You are our family," Elaine replied. "You have been since the night he chose you over himself." She closed his fingers around the case. "Carry it for him. Carry it for all of us." Earl's own medal came next, the 5th Navy Cross that had waited half a century to find its way home. He stood at attention as Caruso pinned it to his chest, adding to the rows of ribbons that told the story of a life spent in service. "Master Chief Earl Jessup," Caruso said formally. "Scarecrow, welcome back." The applause that followed was thunderous. Earl looked out at the crowd and saw faces he recognized. Greta and her elderly mother, who had wept when Earl finally met her and thanked her for 53 years of prayers. Senior Chief Cortez and a contingent of BUD/S instructors who had made Earl's photograph mandatory study for every new class. Commander Yates and a group from her program. Veterans who had found in Earl's story permission to tell their own. And in the front row, Lieutenant Cameron Holt sat with his team. Webb, Brennan, Bishop, young men who had witnessed a confrontation in a bar and emerged from transformed. Holt wore Prophet's Challenge coin on a chain around his neck now, visible above his uniform collar, a reminder of the legacy he had committed himself to honoring. After the ceremony, after the photographs and handshakes and conversations that blurred together in a haze of emotion, Earl found himself standing alone at the edge of the parade ground. The crowd had dispersed. The flag still snapped in the breeze. The sun had begun its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. He pulled the dog tags from beneath his uniform and held them in his palm. His own tags and profits, resting together as they had for 53 years. "We did it, brother," he whispered. "They finally know. They finally understand what you did. Who you were." The breeze picked up, carrying the salt smell of the ocean and something else. Something that felt almost like an answer. Earl smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in longer than he could remember. "Still here, Prophet," he said softly. "Still trying. And I think I've finally figured out what you meant about death being optional. It is not about the body. It is about the spirit. It is about choosing to keep living even when living hurts." He tucked the dog tags back beneath his uniform, next to the medals that now rested against his heart. If this story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in disguises we might never expect, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. And tell us in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose humble appearance hides a story of courage and sacrifice that the world needs to hear? Because every community has a scarecrow. Every neighborhood has a prophet. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one confrontation, one question asked in a bar on a Friday night to bring those legends back into the light. Thank you for watching. And remember, the next time you see an old man in worn clothes sitting quietly in the corner, be careful what assumptions you make. You might just be looking at a legend. The sun set over Coronado. Earl Jessup walked toward his truck, toward the drive back to Nebraska, toward a life that finally had purpose again. Behind him, the flags continued to fly. The ocean continued to roar. And somewhere, in whatever place warriors go when their battles are finally done, Darnell Prophet Washington smiled that crooked smile and whispered the words he had always believed. "Death is optional, brother. And today, you finally chose to live. What is your call sign, old man?" The words cut through the noise of the bar like a blade through fog, sharp and deliberate, and dripping with the kind of contempt that only youth can manufacture. Or did you just see that tattoo in a magazine somewhere and think it looked cool enough to copy? The anchor's rest fell into an uncomfortable hush. Conversations at nearby tables trailed off mid-sentence. Pool cues stopped their rhythmic clicking in the back room. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume, though no one had touched the dial, as if the machine itself understood that something was happening that demanded attention. Earl Franklin Jessup did not look up from his whiskey. His weathered hands remained wrapped around the glass, fingers scarred and calloused from decades of work that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with dirt and sweat and the relentless Nebraska sun. He sat in his usual spot, the booth in the corner where two walls met, where he could see every entrance and exit without appearing to watch anything at all. It was habit, the kind of habit that outlives its usefulness but never quite dies. The young man standing over him wore civilian clothes, but carried himself like he owned the room and everyone in it. His shoulders were thrown back, his jaw set in that particular way that broadcast confidence to everyone watching. A trident pin gleamed on his jacket lapel, polished to a shine that suggested it had been earned recently enough that its owner still felt the need to display it. Behind him, three other young men fanned out in a loose semicircle, their postures echoing his, their expressions caught somewhere between amusement and anticipation. "Just having a quiet drink, son," Earl said. His voice was soft, almost hoarse, the voice of a man who had grown unaccustomed to using it. "Do not mean any trouble to anyone." The young man laughed. It was not a kind sound. He looked back at his companions, inviting them to share in the joke. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa here does not mean any trouble." He leaned closer, and his voice dropped to something that was meant to sound threatening, but came across as theatrical. "Then maybe Grandpa should explain why he's got a trident tattoo on his arm. Because from where I'm standing, that looks like trouble. That looks like stolen valor." At the bar, a woman in her early 50s set down the glass she had been polishing. Greta Mullins had owned the Anchor's Rest for 18 years, ever since her father passed, and left her the keys along with a lifetime of stories about the sailors who had passed through these doors. She knew trouble when she saw it brewing, and she knew Earl Jessup, or at least she knew the version of him that came in on the last Friday of every month, ordered a single whiskey neat, and sat in that same booth for exactly 2 hours before leaving a $20 tip and disappearing into the night. She did not know where he came from or where he went. She did not know why he always sat with his back to the wall, or why his eyes tracked movement around the room, even when he seemed to be staring at nothing. She did not know about the faded ink on his forearm, because he always wore long sleeves, even in summer, and he never rolled them up. But she knew he was a paying customer who had never caused a moment of trouble, and that was enough. Cameron, she called out, using the name she had heard one of the others use. Let the man drink in peace. Lieutenant Junior Grade Cameron Holt did not even glance in her direction. His attention was fixed on Earl, on the sliver of faded blue ink visible where the old man's sleeve had ridden up slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of something that should not be there. Should not be on the arm of a man who looked like he had spent his life wrestling with tractors and fence posts rather than enemies of the state. Roll up your sleeve, Holt demanded. Let's see the whole thing. Prove you earned it. The bar held its breath. At a table near the window, a retired contractor who had spent 20 years working with naval special warfare set down his beer and watched with growing unease. At the far end of the bar, a man in his mid-40s sat alone, nursing a drink and observing the confrontation with eyes that missed nothing. He wore no insignia, displayed no rank, but something in his posture suggested a lifetime of military service. Earl's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind those faded blue eyes. Something old and cold and very, very tired. If you're watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you are joining us from tonight. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or your country. Stories of hidden heroes like this one happen in every community, in every corner of the globe. You might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood, someone whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service and sacrifice. Now let us continue, because what happened next in that bar near Coronado would change everything for everyone who witnessed it. Earl slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes met Holt's for the first time, and the young lieutenant felt something shift in his chest, though he could not have named what it was. Those eyes were not the eyes of a farmer. They were not the eyes of a pretender or a fraud. They were deep and still and somehow ancient, like looking into water that had no bottom, like staring into a darkness that had seen things no training could prepare you for. But Holt was committed now. His team was watching. The bar was watching. He had made his accusation in public, and backing down was not an option. I asked you a question, he said, his voice harder now, edged with the authority he believed his pen had given him. What is your call sign? Or are you going to admit you were just some old farmer playing dress-up in a bar where real operators drink? Earl said nothing. He simply looked at the young man standing over him, looked at the gleaming trident on his lapel, looked at the arrogance that radiated from him like heat from summer asphalt. And somewhere deep inside, in a place he had thought long dead, something stirred. In exactly 47 minutes, Lieutenant Junior Grade Cameron Holt would be on his knees. Not for violence, not from threats, but from the crushing weight of a truth he could never have imagined. Because some tattoos are not copied from magazines. Some tattoos are earned in blood and fire, and the screaming darkness of jungles half a world away. And the quiet old man in the worn overalls was about to remind everyone in the Anchor's Rest what real service looked like. But first, Earl Jessup finished his whiskey. He set the glass down with a soft click that somehow echoed through the silent bar. And when he spoke, his voice was still soft, still hoarse, still the voice of a man who had forgotten how to use it. You do not want to do this, son, he said. Trust me on that. You really do not want to do this. Cameron Holt did not back down. He had never backed down from anything in his 28 years of life. And he was not about to start now. Not in front of his team, not in front of a bar full of witnesses, and certainly not because some weathered old farmer had given him a warning that sounded more like a threat. Roll up your sleeve, he said again, and this time he reached out and gripped Earl's forearm, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to make his intentions clear. I want to see the whole thing. Right now. The touch seemed to break something loose in the air. At the far end of the bar, the man who had been watching with such careful attention set down his drink and turned fully toward the confrontation. His name was Raymond Cortez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, and he had spent the last 12 years of his career training young men to become SEALs of the nearby facility. He had seen thousands of candidates come through his program. He had watched most of them fail, and he had told every single one of them the same stories, the same legends, the same names that were supposed to inspire them to push beyond what they thought possible. One of those names was Scarecrow. Earl looked down at the hand gripping his arm. He did not pull away. He did not resist. He simply looked at it with an expression that might have been sadness or might have been something else entirely, something that had no name in any language Holt had ever learned. "All right," Earl said quietly, "if that is what you need." He reached over with his free hand and slowly, deliberately, rolled up his sleeve. The fabric pulled back to reveal skin that told a story no words could capture. The trident was there, faded but unmistakable, the eagle clutching the anchor and the pistol and the trident itself, all rendered in ink that had aged with the flesh it adorned. But the trident was not alone. Surrounding it, woven through it, were other markings, coordinates etched in precise numerals. A date, November 14th, 71. Initials in a different hand, cruder, the kind of work done in the field with improvised equipment, DW. And scars. So many scars. White lines and puckered circles, and the unmistakable signature of shrapnel that had torn through muscle and stopped just short of bone. Marcus Webb, the quietest member of Holt's team, took an involuntary step backward. He had seen tattoos before. He had seen combat wounds before. But he had never seen anything like this roadmap of violence and survival etched into the flesh of a man who looked like he should be worrying about crop yields and tractor maintenance. Holt stared at the arm he was still holding. His grip had loosened without his realizing it. The coordinates meant nothing to him, just numbers, but something about them felt heavy, felt significant in a way he could not articulate. Earl's mind was somewhere else entirely. The touch on his arm, the demand to reveal what he had kept hidden for so long, had triggered something he had spent decades trying to bury. The bar around him faded, replaced by darkness and heat and the thick green smell of jungle rot. It was November of 1971, and he was 20 years old, though he felt ancient. The Mekong Delta stretched around him like a living thing, hungry and patient and utterly indifferent to the young Americans who moved through its waters and its shadows. He was not Earl Jessup anymore. He was Scarecrow, the skinny kid from Nebraska who had earned his name by refusing to fall down no matter how hard they pushed him, who had proven himself so deadly with a rifle that instructors had stopped betting against him, who had become something more than human in the eyes of the men who serve alongside him. And next to him, always next to him, was Prophet. Petty Officer First Class Darnell Washington had earned his call sign the same way everyone earned theirs, through action rather than choice. He had a gift for sensing danger before it arrived, for knowing when something was wrong before any evidence presented itself. The other men joked that he could smell ambushes the way normal people smelled rain coming. They joked, but they also listened when Prophet said something felt off, because Prophet was never wrong. They had been brothers in everything but blood. Two young men from opposite ends of the country, one black and one white, one from the streets of Detroit, and one from the plains of Nebraska, bound together by training and combat, and the kind of trust that only exists when your life depends on the man beside you. Earl could still hear Prophet's voice in his head, even now, even 53 years later. That low rumble that always seemed to carry a hint of laughter, even in the worst moments. The way he called everyone brother regardless of rank or background. The jokes that never stopped, not even when bullets were flying, not even when everything was falling apart around them. Something is wrong, Prophet had said that night. The words that always preceded disaster. Earl, get down. The memory shattered as Holt's voice cut through. These coordinates, the young lieutenant said, his tone uncertain now, wavering. Were they? What do they mean? Earl blinked. The jungle faded. The bar returned. He looked at Holt with eyes that had seen things no amount of training could prepare anyone for, things that lived in the darkness behind his eyelids every time he closed them. There where it happened, Earl said softly. There where my best friend died, saving my life. His free hand moved to his chest, pressing against the fabric of his flannel shirt. Beneath it, hidden from view, two sets of dog tags hung on a single chain. One set was his own. The other belonged to a man who had been dead for more than half a century, but who had never really left, not entirely, not in any way that mattered. Holt released Earl's arm as if it had burned him. He stepped back, uncertainty flooding his features for the first time since the confrontation began. Behind him, Webb and the others exchanged glances loaded with growing doubt. At the bar, Greta Mullins stared at the old man she had served whiskey to for 6 years without ever really seeing him. Her eyes moved from his exposed arm to the faded photograph on the wall behind the bar, the one that had hung there since her father's time, the one she had never looked at closely because it was just part of the decor, just another piece of history in a place built on history. The photograph showed a group of young men in Vietnam-era gear, their faces barely visible in the aged print. But one of them, the skinny one in the center with the fresh scar running from his temple to his jaw, was looking directly at the camera with eyes that seemed to stare across the decades. Eyes she recognized. Eyes that were looking at her right now from the weathered face of a man she had thought was just a quiet farmer who liked his whiskey neat. Senior Chief Cortez rose slowly from his stool. His heart was hammering against his ribs. His hands were trembling slightly at his sides. He knew those coordinates. He had memorized them years ago, along with every other detail of the operation they marked. It was required study for anyone who wanted to understand what SEALs were capable of, what sacrifice really meant. And he knew that scar. He had shown photographs of it to hundreds of candidates over the years, pointing to the thin white line that ran from temple to jaw and explaining how the man who wore it had earned it in a knife fight in the Mekong Delta, how he had killed 3 enemy combatants with his bare hands after his weapon jammed, how he had kept fighting even as blood poured down his face and into his eyes. The photograph on his office wall, the one with the caption that read, "This is the standard." He was looking at that standard now, alive, in the flesh, wearing overalls and drinking whiskey like any other old man on any other Friday night. It was not possible. Scarecrow was dead. Everyone knew Scarecrow was dead. The name had been retired decades ago out of respect for a legend who had supposedly died in a car accident in 1992. But the man sitting in that booth was not dead. He was very much alive. And in the next few moments, everyone in the Anchor's Rest was going to learn exactly who he was. The bar had become a hell breath. Conversations that had resumed in whispers died completely. The click of pool balls in the back room stopped. Even the neon beer signs seemed to flicker with anticipation, casting red and blue shadows across faces frozen in various stages of realization. Andre Bishop, the youngest member of Holt's team, had his phone raised and recording. He had started filming the moment Holt confronted the old man, thinking he was about to capture a satisfying stolen valor exposure, the kind of video that went viral and earned respect from the community. Now his hand trembled slightly, though he could not have explained why. Something in the air had shifted, something fundamental, and his instincts were screaming that he was recording something far different from what he had anticipated. Holt stood 3 feet from Earl's booth, his earlier confidence crumbling around him like a sandcastle meeting the tide. The coordinates on the old man's arm meant nothing to him specifically, but the way Earl had spoken about them, the weight in his voice when he mentioned his best friend dying, had planted the first seeds of doubt in soil that had never known uncertainty. Anyone can get it done, Holt said, but his voice had lost its edge. Anyone can memorize coordinates and make up a story. That does not prove anything. Earl did not respond. He simply sat there, his sleeves still rolled up, the roadmap of his service exposed for everyone to see. His eyes had drifted to the window, to the darkness beyond where the lights of the naval base glittered in the distance like earthbound stars. He came here every month to be near those lights, to feel some connection to a life he had left behind, to remember what it felt like to belong to something larger than himself. He had not asked for this confrontation. He had not wanted it. But now that it was happening, now that the past was clawing its way into the present whether he liked it or not, he found that he did not have the energy to fight it anymore. "You want proof?" he said quietly, still looking out the window. His voice was distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere very far away. I have spent 53 years trying to forget the proof, trying to outrun it, trying to bury it under enough dirt and work in silence that maybe it would finally leave me alone. He turned back to face Holt, and the young lieutenant flinched at what he saw in those ancient eyes. It does not leave, Earl continued. It never leaves. Every night when I close my eyes, I am back in that jungle. Every morning when I wake up, I reach for dog tags that belong to a dead man. Every time I see young men like you, proud and confident and certain that you understand what service means, I want to tell you that you do not know anything yet. That the knowing comes later, in the dark, when you are alone with the ghosts of everyone you could not save. Greta Mullins moved slowly out from behind the bar. Her eyes kept darting between Earl and the photograph on the wall, the connection solidifying with every passing second. She had looked at that picture 1,000 times without really seeing it. Her father had hung it there decades ago, had told her once that it showed some of the bravest men who ever lived, men who had done things that would never be declassified, things that had kept the country safe while the country slept peacefully unaware. She stopped a few feet from Earl's booth, her hand pressed against her chest as if trying to hold her heart in place. "That picture," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one on the wall. That is you, is it not? The skinny one with the scar." Earl's gaze moved to the photograph. He had noticed it years ago, the first time he walked into this bar. He had almost turned around and left when he saw it, almost fled back into the anonymity he had worked so hard to construct. But something had kept him there, some need to be near the memory, even as he ran from it. "That was a long time ago," he said. "That man does not exist anymore." But Senior Chief Cortez was moving now, pushing past the frozen patrons, his eyes locked on Earl with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He had spent his entire career telling stories about men like this, holding them up as examples of what was possible when human beings pushed beyond every limit. He had believed those stories with something approaching religious faith. And now one of those stories was sitting in front of him, breathing, bleeding, human in a way the legends never were. "Those coordinates," Cortez said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. 10.4521 north, 106.7832 east. November 14th, 1971. That was Operation Crimson River. The extraction that went wrong. 12 Americans trapped behind enemy lines for 36 hours. Earl closed his eyes. The name hit him like a physical blow, like a bullet he had been dodging for half a century, finally finding its mark. "We do not call it that," he said softly. "We called it the night Prophet died." The name hung in the air like smoke, like incense, like a prayer offered to gods who had stopped listening long ago. Cortez's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name too. Everyone who studied the history of naval special warfare knew that name. Petty Officer First Class Darnell Washington, call sign Prophet, killed in action during one of the most famous operations in SEAL history. Killed saving the life of his swim buddy. Killed saving the life of Scarecrow. "Oh my God," Cortez breathed, and his knees actually buckled slightly, forcing him to catch himself on the edge of a nearby table. "Oh my God, it is really you." Holt looked between Cortez and Earl, confusion and dawning horror warring on his face. He did not understand what was happening, did not understand the significance of the names and dates being exchanged, but he understood the reaction of a senior chief who had spent 12 years training SEALs. He understood that kind of reverence, that kind of shock could not be faked. "What is going on?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Who is this guy?" Cortez turned to look at him, and there was something in his eyes that Holt had never seen before, something that looked almost like fear mixed with awe. "This guy," Cortez said slowly, "is the reason you are standing here wearing that trident. This guy is the reason any of us are standing here." He turned back to Earl, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You are Scarecrow. The Scarecrow. We thought you were dead. Everyone thought you were dead." Earl opened his eyes. The weariness in them was bottomless, oceanic, the accumulated exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight too heavy for any human being to bear. "The man you were talking about died a long time ago," he said, "in that jungle, with his best friend bleeding out in his arms. What is left is just a farmer who wanted a quiet drink." But even as he said the words, he knew they were not true. The man he had been, the operator who had earned the name Scarecrow through blood and fire and unimaginable sacrifice, was still in there somewhere. Buried deep, locked away, but not dead, never dead. And in the back room of the Anchor's Rest, separated from the main bar by a single door, Rear Admiral Vincent Caruso set down his wine glass as his aide leaned in to whisper something urgent in his ear. The Admiral's face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He had waited 53 years for this moment. 53 years to find the man who had saved his life when he was just a terrified young ensign on his first operation, certain he was going to die in a jungle half a world away from everyone he loved. And now that man was just 30 feet away, surrounded by people who had no idea what they were witnessing. Scarecrow. The name rippled through the bar like a stone dropped into still water. Those who recognized it went rigid, their faces cycling through disbelief and shock and something approaching reverence. Those who did not recognize it looked to their neighbors for explanation, sensing from the reactions around them that something significant had just occurred. Tyler Brennan, who had been standing slightly behind Holt throughout the confrontation, grabbed his team leader's arm and pulled him back a step. His voice was low and urgent when he spoke. "Cam," he said, "we need to stop. Right now. Do you understand what he just said? Do you know who Scarecrow is?" Holt shook his head, frustration and confusion battling for dominance on his face. He had heard the name before, somewhere in the fog of training and briefings and late-night stories exchanged in barracks, but he could not place it, could not connect it to anything concrete. "Scarecrow was the best of us," Brennan continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The best there ever was. They retired his call sign in 1992. Nobody has used it since. It is like retiring a jersey number. You do not do that for just anyone." At the far end of the bar, Senior Chief Cortez had steadied himself against the table but had not moved any closer. He was staring at Earl with an expression that combined the awe of a pilgrim reaching a holy site with the disbelief of a scientist confronting the impossible. His mind was racing through every story he had ever told, every legend he had passed down to the young men in his charge, trying to reconcile the mythic figure of his narratives with a weathered old farmer sitting in that corner booth. The story said Scarecrow died in a car accident, Cortez said, more to himself than anyone else. 1992. They said he survived everything the enemy could throw at him and then got killed by a drunk driver 6 months after retirement. That is what they told us. Earl's laugh was soft and bitter, carrying no humor at all. "They told you what I asked them to tell you. What I needed them to tell you." He shook his head slowly, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. "I could not be that man anymore. Not after Margaret died. Not after I buried my wife and realized I'd spent so many years being Scarecrow that I had forgotten how to be Earl. So I asked them to let me disappear, and they did." The mention of his wife seemed to cost him something. His hand moved again to his chest, pressing against the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt, and his eyes grew distant with a different kind of grief, a different kind of loss layered on top of the old wounds that had never fully healed. Greta stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Your wife," she said. "How long ago?" 11 years, Earl replied. "Cancer. Took her in 8 months. Fastest and slowest 8 months of my life." He fell silent, lost in memory. Margaret had been the only person who ever saw both sides of him, the operator and the man, the legend and the human being beneath the legend. She had married him knowing what he was, knowing what he had done, knowing the ghost that followed him everywhere. And she had loved him anyway, had built a life with him on that Nebraska farm, had given him 2 children and 30 years of something approaching peace. When she died, the peace died with her, and the ghost came back stronger than ever. In the back room, Admiral Caruso pushed back from the table and rose to his feet. His dinner companions, a collection of senior officers and their spouses gathered for a retirement celebration, looked up in surprise at his abrupt movement. "Vince," one of them said, a captain with 30 years of service and a face weathered by salt spray and responsibility. "What is wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Caruso did not answer. He was already moving toward the door, his aide trailing behind him with a bewildered expression. The Admiral's mind was 53 years in the past, in a jungle that smelled like rot and cordite and fear, surrounded by the sounds of gunfire and screaming and the wet thud of bullets hitting flesh. He had been 22 years old. Ensign Vincent Caruso. First deployment. First operation. First time facing the reality that the enemy was not an abstract concept, but flesh and blood human beings who wanted him dead. Everything had gone wrong from the moment they inserted. Bad intelligence. Compromised extraction point. Enemy forces that seemed to materialize out of the jungle itself. Endless waves of them, more than anyone had predicted. 12 Americans had found themselves trapped in a valley with no way out and no hope of rescue until morning. Caruso had been certain he was going to die. He had made his peace with it, had said his prayers, had thought about his mother and father and the girl he had been dating back home. He had resigned himself to becoming another name on another wall. And then Scarecrow had appeared. Not appeared. That was the wrong word. Scarecrow had materialized, had emerged from the darkness like something born of it, like a creature that existed outside the normal rules of human limitation. He had moved through the enemy positions like smoke through fingers, silent and deadly and utterly unstoppable. And then he had reached their position, had looked at the 12 terrified Americans huddled in that valley, and had said 5 words that Caruso would never forget. Stay down. I will handle this. For 36 hours, Scarecrow had held that position. Alone, with 2 bullets in him that he did not mention until after the extraction helicopters arrived. He had killed 37 enemy combatants by the official count, though the real number was probably higher. He had kept 12 Americans alive through sheer force of will and a level of skill that bordered on the supernatural. And when it was over, when the helicopters finally came and the survivors were loaded aboard, Caruso had turned to thank him and found that Scarecrow was already gone, vanished back into the jungle as silently as he had arrived. Caruso had spent the rest of his career trying to find that man, trying to thank him, trying to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. He had risen through the ranks, had become an admiral, had commanded ships and men and operations that shaped the course of history. And through it all, he had never stopped looking. When they told him Scarecrow was dead, something inside him had broken. The chance for closure, for gratitude, for simply shaking the hand of the man who had saved his life had been stolen from him by a drunk driver on Nebraska highway. Except now, if his aide was telling the truth, that man was not dead at all. He was sitting in the main bar of the Anchor's Rest, surrounded by young SEALs who had no idea who they were talking to. Caruso pushed through the door and stepped into the main room. His dress uniform drew immediate attention, heads turning, bodies straightening instinctively. A rear admiral did not walk into a place like this unnoticed. A rear admiral commanded attention simply by existing. But Caruso was not looking at the young sailors who snapped to something approaching attention. He was not looking at the civilians who stared with curious eyes. He was looking at the corner booth, at the weathered old man in the flannel shirt and overalls, at the faded tattoo on the exposed forearm and the scar that ran from temple to jaw. 53 years melted away. The admiral was 22 again, terrified and certain of death, watching a shadow emerge from the jungle with 5 words on his lips. And now, finally, he could say what he had wanted to say for more than half a century. His voice cracked when he spoke, breaking on emotions that he had carried since before many of the people in this room were born. I have been looking for you, he said, for 53 years.